Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, in its postmortem of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, the Fed found that legislation passed out of this committee in 2018 led to weakened rules for big banks that were major contributors to SVB's failure. The lessons, I think, are clear. Regulators need to strengthen bank oversight, and Congress must reinstate stronger rules. And here's a place to start. SVB, Signature Bank, and First Republic all lobbied Congress to weaken the guardrails, preventing them from making risky bets with depositors' money. And then, surprise, surprise, these executives took risks to boost their short-term profits, gave themselves huge salaries and bonuses and stock options, and when they crashed their banks, they walked away with fortunes. That's why Senators Cortez Masto, Senator Hawley, Senator Braun, and I introduced a bipartisan bill to ensure that when executives crash their banks and threaten the banking system, those executives are forced to give up their fancy compensation packages. Professor Lin, you are an expert on corporate governance and financial regulation. If our Failed Bank Executives Clawback Act, which applies to failed banks no matter how they are dealt with by the FDIC, had been the law of the land when SVB failed, would it have applied to SVB executives?
Yes, I believe so, Senator.
And would it have applied to Signature executives?
I believe so, Senator.
And would it have applied to First Republic executives?
I believe so.
All right. SVB, Signature, and First Republic were resolved by the FDIC through different processes using different statutory authorities. To make clawbacks effective, we have to give regulators broad authority to clawback executive pay whenever banks collapse, regardless of the specific process that the FDIC uses to pick up the pieces. Now, unsurprisingly, bank executives hate clawbacks. They want to keep on taking risks with zero consequences. Professor Lin, if our banking regulators had the choice whether or not to claw back executive compensation after a bank failure, would you expect Wall Street to exert significant pressure on them not to use that authority?
Yes, I think that's a real possibility.
You know, it is clear that giving regulators power to do something is not always enough. Congress needs to force regulators to use it, which is what Senators Cortez Masto, Hawley, and Braun's and my bill does. Now, in its review of the SVB collapse, the Government Accountability Office found that, quote, in the 5 years prior to 2023, regulators identified concerns with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, but both banks were slow to mitigate the problems the regulators identified, and risk built up over time. Professor Schooner, if regulators had had the authority they needed to claw back compensation from SVB executives, would it be reasonable, in your view, for them to consider the executives' actions and pay since 2018, when the regulators first began warning SVB about its risky practices?
Senator, I think that would be very reasonable. Incentive arrangements often rely on short-term metrics that it takes the long term to determine whether those involve excessive risk. So I think giving regulators the opportunity to capture that kind of excessive risk-taking is reasonable.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. You know, Congress needs to put in place tough rules that make sure that executives pay up when their actions lead directly to a bank failure. And in order for us to do that, the regulation needs to do three things: force regulators to claw back compensation from the executives who are responsible for the failure. Second, apply in all cases of bank failure, no matter how the particular form comes out. And third, allow up to 5 years of compensation to be clawed back. My bill, with Senators Cortez Masto, Hawley, and Braun, achieves all three of those, and I hope that this committee will take action on it soon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.